They thought she was just a maid. But that night, the entire room was about to be judged by how they treated her. The black sedan hadn't even finished rolling to a stop at the curb when the first guests began stepping out, heels clicking against polished stone, laughter floating beneath strings of warm golden lights that stretched across the entrance like something out of a movie. The kind of place where people wore confidence as easily as tailored suits and silk dresses, where every glance carried status and every smile measured worth. And right there at the edge of it all stood Lena Carter, her posture straight, her hands steady, dressed in a simple black uniform that marked her as invisible before she ever spoke a word. And still, she stepped forward toward the velvet rope as if she belonged, as if she had every right to be there. But the guard didn't even hesitate, his eyes scanning her from head to toe in less than a second before his hand lifted, firm, final, blocking her path without a single ounce of doubt. "Staff entrance is around the back," he said, already turning away, as though the conversation was over before it began. But Lena didn't move, not yet, her fingers tightening slightly around the black envelope she held, its edges crisp, untouched, almost out of place against the worn softness of her sleeves. "I'm not here for the staff entrance," she replied quietly, her voice steady, respectful, but not apologetic. And that was enough to draw attention. A flicker at first, then a shift in the air as a couple nearby slowed their steps, curiosity slipping into amusement. "Oh, this should be interesting," one woman murmured under her breath, her tone light but edged with something sharper, something colder, the kind of casual cruelty that didn't need to raise its volume to be heard. The guard sighed, already impatient, already done. "Ma'am, you don't have clearance for this event," he said, louder now, making sure the people around them could hear, and just like that, the moment expanded, stretching outward as more eyes turned, more whispers gathered, the quiet hum of judgment building like a current beneath the surface. "Did she get lost?" a man in a navy suit asked, barely hiding his smirk. "Or did someone forget to tell her this isn't a public place?" another voice added, laughter following, soft at first, then growing, not loud enough to cause a scene, but enough to make the message clear. "You don't belong here." Lena stood there through it all, her shoulders squared, her gaze calm, not challenging, not defensive, just present. And that alone seemed to irritate them more, because she didn't shrink, didn't apologize, didn't retreat the way they expected her to. "You're holding up the entrance." The guard pressed, his tone sharpening now. "Step aside." But still she didn't move. Instead, she glanced briefly at the grand doors beyond him, the ones that opened into a world she had spent weeks cleaning without ever being seen. Floors she polished until they reflected light like glass. Tables she set with precision, while conversations above her head flowed as if she didn't exist. And now here she was, standing at the threshold, seen for the first time, but only as something to be removed. "I have an invitation," she said, finally lifting the envelope just enough for it to catch the light. A subtle motion, but it landed. The black paper, the embossed seal, details that didn't match the story they had already written about her. The guard hesitated for half a second, just long enough for doubt to flicker. But then it was gone, replaced by certainty, the kind that comes from assumptions made too quickly to question. "Anyone can pick up a piece of paper," he replied, dismissing it with a wave, and the laughter returned. A little louder this time, a little more confident, because now they had permission to enjoy it. "This is embarrassing," the woman in heels whispered, not quietly enough. Someone should really escort her out. Phones lifted, subtle at first, then less so, lenses angled, capturing the moment because humiliation, when dressed in elegance, becomes entertainment. And Lena knew it. She felt it. The weight of their eyes, the way the air tightened around her. But still, she stayed, her grip steady on that envelope, her expression unchanged. Not because she didn't feel it, but because she had already decided something they hadn't yet understood. She wasn't leaving. Not until what needed to happen, happened, and somewhere above them, unseen. A small red light blinked quietly in the corner of a security camera, recording everything, every word, every glance, every choice, while the doors behind the velvet rope remained closed, waiting as if the night itself was holding its breath. The laughter did not fade, it settled, weaving itself into the night like background music that no one questioned anymore. And Lena could feel the way it reshaped the space around her, how it turned curiosity into certainty, certainty into dismissal, as if the story about her had already been written and agreed upon without her ever speaking more than a sentence. And still she stood there, her shoes planted firmly on the polished stone that reflected the glow of overhead lights, her reflection faint but present beneath her, a quiet reminder that she was not invisible, no matter how hard they tried to make her disappear. The guard shifted his weight, irritation building in the tight line of his jaw. "I am not going to ask again," he said, his voice lower now, but edged with warning. The kind meant to close a situation quickly, efficiently, without escalation. But the situation did not close, because Lena did not move, and that refusal, silent as it was, disrupted the rhythm of control he was used to. Behind him the doors opened briefly as another group of guests was welcomed inside, a burst of warm light spilling outward along with soft music and the clink of glasses, a glimpse of the world she was being denied, and just as quickly, the doors closed again, sealing that world away. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," the guard added, glancing around as more attention gathered, his authority now being observed, measured, and he needed to maintain it. "Sir, maybe she just does not understand," a man in a charcoal suit offered, stepping slightly closer, his tone carrying that polished politeness that barely concealed condescension. "Sometimes people think if they act confident enough, they can get into places they are not supposed to be." A soft chuckle followed, and a few others joined in, the kind of laughter that bonded strangers through shared judgment. Lena heard every word, but her focus did not shift to them. It remained steady, forward, anchored somewhere beyond the barrier, as if she was waiting for something none of them could see yet. Her thumb brushed lightly along the edge of the envelope again, not nervous, not fidgeting, just present, deliberate. And that small movement caught the eye of a woman standing near the entrance, tall, poised, wrapped in a dress that shimmered with every step she took. "Let me see that," the woman said suddenly, stepping closer without asking permission, her hand extending toward the envelope as if it already belonged to her. Lena hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Then she handed it over, calmly. The woman turned it between her fingers, examining the seal, her brows drawing together slightly, confusion flickering beneath her composed expression because it did not match what she expected. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice quieter now, less certain. But before Lena could answer, the guard interjected, eager to reclaim control. "It does not matter. Ma'am, we deal with situations like this all the time," he said, reaching to take the envelope back. But the woman did not release it immediately, her gaze lingering on the embossed mark. Something about it unfamiliar in a way that unsettled her. "This is not standard," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. And for a moment, just a moment, the air shifted, doubt threading its way into the scene. But doubt is fragile in a crowd that prefers certainty, and it did not take long for someone to dismiss it. "It is probably fake," another guest said lightly, waving it off. "People can print anything these days." And just like that, the balance tipped back. The woman exhaled softly, handing the envelope back to the guard, her earlier hesitation smoothed over by the comfort of consensus. "Handle it," she said, stepping away, her interest already fading. The guard nodded, relief flickering across his face as he regained the upper hand. He held the envelope now, looking at it as if it were nothing more than a prop in a situation he needed to resolve. "Last chance," he said, extending it back toward Lena, his tone final. "You take this and you leave, or I call management to remove you from the property." The word remove hung in the air, heavy, deliberate, and around them. The watchers leaned in just slightly, anticipation replacing boredom, because now it was reaching a point where something had to happen. Lena accepted the envelope again, her fingers closing around it with the same steady control she had shown from the beginning. She looked at the guard, really looked at him for the first time, not with anger, not with pleading, but with a kind of quiet clarity that did not fit the role they had assigned her. "You should call them," she said, her voice calm, even carrying just enough to be heard by those closest, and that response landed differently. It did not escalate, it did not challenge, but it did not comply either, and that made it unsettling. The guard frowned, thrown off by the lack of resistance he could push against. "Fine," he said, reaching for his radio, his thumb pressing down as he turned slightly away, speaking into it in a low voice, requesting a supervisor, reinforcing procedure, restoring order. And as he spoke, Lena remained exactly where she was, her gaze lifting briefly past him, past the doors, toward the upper level of the building where the glass reflected the lights of the city beyond. And for just a second, her expression softened, not with doubt, but with recognition, as if somewhere beyond their understanding, something had already begun to move, something that would not be stopped by a velvet rope or a guarded assumption. And the camera above continued to blink, recording every second, every word, every choice, waiting for the moment when everything would change. The static crackle of the radio seemed louder than it should have been, cutting through the soft hum of music and conversation behind the doors, and for a moment, it became the center of everything, the signal that something official was about to happen, something that would restore order, or at least confirm what everyone already believed, that Lena Carter did not belong here. The guard straightened slightly as he spoke into it, his tone controlled, professional, requesting a supervisor to the front entrance, emphasizing the situation just enough to justify escalation without making it sound like a problem he could not handle himself. And when he released the button, a quiet confidence returned to his posture, as if the next few minutes would resolve everything in his favor. Around him the small crowd had grown, not dramatically, but enough that the energy had shifted from casual observation to something more focused, more invested. People lingered instead of moving on, drawn by the subtle promise of resolution, of seeing how this would end, because in places like this, endings mattered. They reinforced the invisible rules everyone followed, the rules about who was welcome and who was not. Lena remained still, her presence unchanged, and that consistency began to feel almost out of place in contrast to the subtle restlessness around her. A man checked his watch, another glanced toward the arriving vehicles. A pair of women whispered behind raised hands, their eyes flicking between Lena and the guard, their expressions carrying that mix of curiosity and quiet judgment that required no words to communicate. "I have seen this before," one of them murmured, her voice low but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "They always think there is some kind of exception for them." And the other nodded, her lips curving into a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "Confidence can be mistaken for permission," she replied. And again there was that soft ripple of agreement, the kind that settles quickly when it aligns with expectation, but beneath it all, something was not aligning, not completely, because Lena did not react the way they expected. She did not grow flustered, did not plead, did not attempt to explain further. Instead, she simply waited, her gaze steady, her breathing even, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond this moment. And that quiet certainty, though subtle, began to unsettle the edges of the scene. The guard noticed it too, though he could not have explained why. There was something about her stillness that made his earlier confidence feel slightly less solid, like a surface that had shifted just enough to be felt but not seen. He cleared his throat, adjusting his stance, reclaiming control in small, deliberate ways. "Supervisor will be here in a minute," he announced, more to the crowd than to Lena, reinforcing that the process was underway. That authority was being applied, and that soon this would be over. A few people nodded, satisfied by the reassurance, while others leaned in just a little more, their attention sharpening, because now there was a timeline, a point where everything would converge. Lena lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in thought, her fingers brushing once more along the edge of the envelope, the motion almost meditative, grounding. And in that small movement, a memory surfaced, not spoken, not shared, but present in the quiet set of her expression. Long hours spent moving through rooms like a shadow, learning the patterns of a place where power was not announced but assumed, where decisions were made in low voices behind closed doors, and where people like her existed only in the margins, unseen until they disrupted something. And tonight, she had stepped out of that margin, not by accident, but by choice. The sound of approaching footsteps broke through the tension, measured, purposeful, and all eyes turned toward the direction of the building as a man in a tailored suit emerged from the side entrance, his posture upright, his expression composed, the kind of presence that signaled authority without needing to raise its voice. The supervisor had arrived, and with him came a shift, subtle but immediate. Conversations quieted, attention sharpened, because now the situation would be addressed by someone who represented the rules of this place. The man approached the group, his gaze moving first to the guard, then to Lena, taking in the scene with practiced efficiency. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked, his tone neutral, controlled, but carrying the weight of expectation. The guard stepped forward slightly, eager to present his case, to frame the narrative before it could be questioned. "She does not have clearance to enter," he said, gesturing toward Lena with a firm, decisive motion. "Claims to have an invitation, but it does not check out." The supervisor nodded slowly, absorbing the information, then turned his attention fully to Lena, and for the first time since the situation began. Someone looked at her not as an interruption, but as a variable to be understood. His eyes lingered on the envelope in her hands, then returned to her face, measuring, calculating. "May I see it?" he asked, extending his hand. And the request was different from the others, not dismissive, not impatient, but deliberate. Lena held his gaze for a moment, then placed the envelope in his hand, and as he examined it, the air seemed to tighten again, anticipation building, because now the moment had arrived, the point where assumption would either be confirmed or challenged. And for a brief second, just before he spoke, the entire entrance felt suspended, as if the night itself was waiting to see which version of the story would survive. The supervisor turned the envelope slowly between his fingers, not rushed, not dismissive, but deliberate in a way that immediately shifted the energy around him, because unlike the others, he was not reacting to what Lena looked like. He was examining what she carried, and that difference, subtle as it was, created a small fracture in the certainty that had filled the air moments before. The embossed seal caught the light again, sharper now, more defined under his careful gaze, and his brow tightened almost imperceptibly. Not confusion exactly, but recognition trying to surface through something unexpected. He flipped the envelope once, then again, as if confirming that what he saw was not a trick of lighting or assumption. The crowd leaned in without meaning to, their earlier confidence softening into curiosity, because the script they had been following was beginning to hesitate. "Is there a problem?" the guard asked, a hint of impatience slipping into his voice. Eager to move forward, to restore the narrative he had already established. But the supervisor did not answer immediately, his attention still fixed on the envelope, his thumb brushing along the edge where the seal met the paper, feeling it, verifying it in a way that suggested experience rather than doubt. Lena watched him quietly, her expression unchanged, but there was something in the stillness between them now, something different from before. Not tension exactly, but alignment, as if this moment had always been part of a larger design. "Where did you get this?" the supervisor asked finally, his voice lower than before, less for the crowd, more for her. And again, the question landed differently, not accusatory, but searching. Lena met his eyes, steady, unshaken. "It was given to me," she replied, simple, direct, offering nothing more than what was necessary. And that answer, instead of closing the gap, seemed to deepen it, because it did not fit neatly into the assumptions that had been built around her. The supervisor inhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward the entrance doors, then back to Lena, and in that glance, something changed, a calculation, a realization beginning to take shape. "Sir, we cannot let just anyone walk in here." The guard pressed, stepping closer, his voice firmer now, almost defensive, sensing that control was slipping in a way he did not fully understand. "This event is restricted. We have protocols." The supervisor nodded once, acknowledging the statement without confirming it, his focus still divided between the envelope in his hand and the woman standing before him. "Yes," he said quietly, "we do." And then, without warning, he opened the envelope, the motion small but decisive, the seal breaking with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been, the kind of sound that signals a boundary being crossed. Inside, a single card rested, thick, heavy stock. The kind used for invitations that were not mass-produced but selected, intentional. He slid it out carefully, his eyes scanning the surface, and for a brief moment his expression remained neutral, unreadable, but then, almost imperceptibly, it shifted, not dramatically, not enough for the crowd to fully understand, but enough to register that something had changed. The certainty that had defined his posture when he arrived softened, replaced by something more measured, more cautious. The guard noticed it immediately, his own confidence faltering as he leaned slightly to catch a glimpse. But the supervisor angled the card just enough to keep it out of view. A small, controlled gesture that reasserted authority in a different way. "Is it valid?" someone from the crowd asked. Unable to contain the curiosity that had replaced earlier amusement, the question hung there, unanswered for a beat longer than expected. And in that pause, the atmosphere shifted again. The easy judgment that had filled the entrance beginning to dissolve into something less comfortable, less certain. The supervisor looked back at Lena, his eyes sharper now, not cold, but aware, as if he were seeing her for the first time beyond the surface they had all accepted. "You have been waiting here the entire time," he asked, and the question carried weight, not because of its content, but because of what it implied. Lena nodded once, yes, she said, and that was all. No explanation, no defense, just the truth. And somehow, that simplicity landed heavier than anything else she could have said. The supervisor exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping once more to the card, then lifting again toward the doors, where the music continued, uninterrupted, unaware of the shift taking place just outside, and for a moment he did not move, as if considering the consequences of what came next. The guard shifted again, uncertainty creeping into his stance. "Sir," he prompted, quieter now, less certain than before, and the supervisor finally looked at him, not with anger, not with reprimand, but with a calm that felt more significant than either. "We will proceed carefully," he said, his voice even controlled, and then he stepped slightly aside, positioning himself not between Lena and the entrance, but beside her. A subtle change, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it. But it was enough to alter the shape of the moment, enough to signal that whatever this situation was, it was no longer as simple as they had believed. And above them, the small red light continued to blink, recording the exact second when certainty gave way to something far more revealing. The supervisor did not move immediately, and that stillness, subtle but deliberate, began to ripple outward through the crowd like a quiet signal that something had shifted beyond their understanding. Because moments ago, this had been simple, a clear line between who belonged and who did not. But now that line had blurred in a way no one had prepared for. The guard glanced at him again, waiting for the expected command, the confirmation that this situation would end the way all the others had. But it did not come. Instead, the supervisor turned slightly toward Lena, his posture no longer positioned to block her path, but no longer fully aligned with the authority he had come to represent. It was something in between, something transitional, and that made everyone uneasy. "Who gave this to you?" he asked again, not because he had not heard her before, but because now the question carried a different weight, a need to understand rather than dismiss. Lena held his gaze, calm, grounded, as if the answer did not need to be expanded to be understood. "It was delivered this morning," she said, her voice even, and though the words were simple, they landed differently this time, because they introduced timing, intention, design, elements that did not fit into the assumption of coincidence or mistake. The supervisor's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition of a pattern forming, something deliberate, something that suggested this was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, but a placement, a decision made before any of them arrived at this entrance. Behind them, the doors opened again, a soft wave of music spilling outward along with the glow of chandeliers and the low hum of conversation. And for a second, the contrast was almost striking. Inside, everything continued as planned, elegant, controlled, unaware, while outside, something far less predictable was unfolding. The supervisor glanced toward the opening, then back to Lena. And in that brief shift, a realization settled deeper into his expression. "You were not expecting to be stopped," he said quietly, not as an accusation, but as an observation. Lena shook her head once. "No," she replied. And that answer, simple as it was, carried a quiet certainty that did not leave room for doubt, because she had not come here hoping to be allowed in. She had come knowing she would be, and that difference changed everything. The guard exhaled sharply, frustration edging into his movements now. "Sir, with all due respect, we cannot delay the entrance for this. he said, gesturing subtly toward the guests who were still waiting, still watching, their attention no longer casual but fixed, invested in the outcome. If we make exceptions, it sets a precedent. The supervisor listened, but his focus had shifted, no longer anchored to procedure alone, but to something broader, something that extended beyond this single moment. He looked down at the card again, reading it once more, as if confirming what he already knew. And then he closed the envelope carefully, his movements precise, controlled, the kind that signaled a decision had been made, though not yet spoken. The crowd sensed it, the shift tightening the air, anticipation replacing the earlier ease of judgment, because now they were no longer watching someone be turned away. They were watching something unfold that they did not fully understand, and that made it harder to predict, harder to control. "We will not remove her," the supervisor said finally, his voice calm but firm, and the words landed with a quiet force that silenced the immediate space around them. The guard blinked, caught off guard by the direction of the statement. "But sir, she does not have clearance," he insisted, though his tone had lost some of its earlier certainty. "She has something else," the supervisor replied, and though he did not elaborate, the implication hung in the air, heavier than any explanation could have been. Lena remained still, her presence unchanged. But now the space around her had shifted, subtly but undeniably. The distance between her and the entrance no longer defined solely by rejection, but by something unresolved, something waiting to be revealed. One of the guests shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. "What does that even mean?" she whispered to the person beside her, but there was no answer. Because for the first time since Lena had arrived, the narrative was no longer clear. The supervisor stepped slightly forward, aligning himself closer to Lena. Not in protection, not yet, but in acknowledgement. A small but significant shift that did not go unnoticed. The guard hesitated, his authority no longer absolute in this moment, his next move unclear, and that hesitation, brief as it was, signaled a crack in the structure everyone had relied on. Above them, the camera continued to record, capturing the exact second where procedure gave way to uncertainty, where assumptions began to unravel, and somewhere beyond the entrance, beyond the music and the lights, something else was already in motion, something that had not yet revealed itself, but was drawing closer with every passing second. And Lena, standing exactly where she had been from the beginning, seemed to be the only one who understood that this moment was not a delay. It was a beginning. The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Not loud, not dramatic, but heavy enough to quiet even the softest whispers. Because when the supervisor said she had something else, it was not just a statement, it was a fracture in the certainty everyone had been holding on to. And fractures have a way of spreading. The guard shifted again, his fingers brushing the edge of his radio as if searching for something familiar to anchor himself to. But there was nothing left to reinforce, only the uncomfortable space between what he thought he knew and what he was beginning to question. "Something else does not override protocol," he said, but his voice no longer carried the same authority. It sounded thinner now, less certain, as if even he could hear the gap forming beneath his words. The supervisor did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply looked at him, calm, measured. And in that look was something far more powerful than correction. It was clarity. "Tonight is not about protocol," he said quietly, and that sentence, simple as it was, landed like a shift in gravity, because it implied that whatever this night was, it followed rules none of them fully understood yet. A subtle murmur moved through the crowd again, but this time it was different, less confident, more uncertain. People exchanged glances instead of comments, their earlier amusement replaced by curiosity, edged with unease, because the situation was no longer predictable. And unpredictability, in a place built on control, felt like disruption. Lena remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. But now the space around her had transformed. Not physically, but in perception. She was no longer just the woman at the edge of the entrance. She was the center of something unfolding, something no one had anticipated. The supervisor stepped slightly closer to her, not enough to draw attention, but enough to create a subtle alignment. And that movement, though quiet, was unmistakable. It was not protection, not yet, but it was recognition. And recognition, in this world, was the first step toward power. The guard noticed it, his jaw tightening as he recalibrated, trying to regain footing in a situation that no longer followed his expectations. If this is some kind of mistake, it needs to be corrected now, he said, though the urgency in his tone felt less like authority and more like discomfort. The supervisor exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting once more to the doors, then back to Lena, as if measuring time itself. "It will be," he replied, and the words carried a certainty that did not invite further argument, because they did not rely on explanation. They relied on something already set in motion, behind them. Another vehicle pulled up, its engine humming softly before the door opened. And this time, the arrival felt different, not because of who stepped out yet, but because of the way the energy shifted before they even appeared, the subtle straightening of staff, the quiet adjustment of posture among those closest to the entrance, as if something unspoken had just entered the perimeter. The guard noticed it too, his attention flicking toward the curb, momentarily distracted, and in that brief shift, the control he had been trying to hold slipped just a little further. The supervisor did not turn immediately, but Lena did, just slightly, her gaze lifting toward the arriving figure with a calm that suggested recognition, not surprise, and that small movement did not go unnoticed. One of the guests followed her line of sight, then another, and suddenly the focus began to drift away from Lena, not completely, but enough to divide attention, to introduce a new variable into the moment. Footsteps approached, measured, unhurried, carrying with them a presence that did not need announcement, because it was felt before it was seen. The kind of presence that altered the air simply by entering it. Conversations softened, not out of instruction, but instinct, the way people adjust when something greater than themselves moves through a space. The supervisor finally turned, his posture straightening just slightly, not in fear, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. And the guard, sensing the shift, followed, his earlier frustration dissolving into something quieter, more cautious, because whatever was happening now, it was no longer within his control. Lena remained still, her expression unchanged, but her eyes held something new, not anticipation, not relief, but confirmation, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. And as the figure stepped closer, just beyond the edge of full view, the entire entrance seemed to hold its breath, suspended between what had been assumed and what was about to be revealed. And for the first time that night, no one laughed, no one whispered. Because whatever came next, they all understood, even if they could not yet explain it, that this was no longer about a woman being denied entry. This was about something far bigger, something that had been unfolding long before any of them decided who she was. The moment stretched just long enough to become unbearable, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but heavy, filled with something unspoken, something waiting. And then he stepped fully into the light. Adrian Volkov, his presence unmistakable even to those who had only ever heard his name spoken in lowered voices. The kind of man who did not need to announce himself because the room adjusted the second he arrived. His tailored black suit catching the soft glow of the entrance lights. His posture effortless yet commanding. And the shift was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, shoulders straightened, and even the guard who had stood so firm moments before felt the instinct to step back half an inch without realizing it. Adrian's gaze moved across the scene with quiet precision, not rushed, not searching, but knowing, as if he already understood more than anyone there could explain. His eyes passed over the gathered guests, the supervisor, the guard, and then they landed on Lena, and in that single moment, something changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because he did not look at her the way the others had, not with confusion, not with dismissal, but with recognition. The kind that does not need confirmation, the kind that carries history. The supervisor inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect rather than obligation. "Mr. Volkov," he said, his voice steady but quieter now, and the name alone moved through the crowd like a current, shifting attention, sharpening awareness, because now they understood that whatever this moment was, it had just reached a level none of them could ignore. Adrian did not respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on Lena, taking in the details others had used to define her, the simplicity of her clothing, the envelope in her hand, the stillness in her posture. And then, slowly, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them with measured ease. The kind that did not rush because it did not need to. Every step deliberate, controlled. And as he approached, the space around them seemed to adjust, widening just enough to create a clear line, a path that had not existed seconds before. The guard swallowed, his earlier certainty dissolving completely now, replaced by something closer to unease, because the situation had moved beyond him entirely. "Is there an issue?" Adrian asked finally, his voice calm, low, carrying just enough to be heard without needing to rise. And the question, simple as it was, did not feel like a request for information. It felt like an assessment. The supervisor answered carefully, aware now that every word mattered. "There was a question regarding entry," he said, choosing precision over assumption. Adrian's gaze shifted briefly to him, acknowledging the response, then returned to Lena. And what was the conclusion he asked? And this time, the silence that followed was different, not uncertain, but expectant, because the answer would define everything that came next. The supervisor hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but out of awareness. "She has a valid invitation," he said, and the words settled into the space with quiet weight. Adrian nodded once, as if confirming something he had never questioned, and then, without looking at the guard, without raising his voice, he spoke again. "Then why is she still outside?" And that question, simple and direct, cut through the entire scene with a clarity no one could deflect. The guard felt it immediately, the weight of it pressing against the assumptions he had made, the decisions he had enforced, and for the first time since the situation began, he did not have an immediate answer. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. The words he had relied on no longer sufficient. The crowd watched, silent now, no longer participants, but witnesses, because the narrative had shifted completely, and in that shift, their earlier laughter felt distant, misplaced. Adrian took one final step forward, stopping just in front of Lena, close enough that the difference between them, in power, in perception, in everything the world had assigned to each of them, should have been overwhelming. But it was not, because the way he looked at her erased that distance entirely, not by lowering himself, but by recognizing her fully, without hesitation, and then, with a calm that carried more authority than any command, he extended his hand slightly toward the entrance, not touching her, not guiding her, simply opening the path that had been denied. "You are exactly where you are meant to be," he said. And the words did not just grant permission, they revealed something far deeper, something that had been hidden beneath every assumption made that night. The guard stepped back completely now, the invisible line he had enforced dissolving in an instant. The supervisor remained still, understanding that the moment had moved beyond protocol entirely, and Lena, for the first time, shifted her weight forward, not hesitantly, not cautiously, but with quiet certainty, stepping past the threshold that had once been closed to her, and as she did, the room did not erupt. No one spoke, no one reacted, because the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, full of realization, full of the unspoken understanding that what they had witnessed was not just a correction, it was a revelation, and Adrian, standing beside her now, did not look back at the crowd, because he did not need to. The lesson had already been delivered in the only way that mattered. The moment Lena crossed the threshold, the air inside shifted in a way that could not be undone, not because of noise or spectacle, but because of silence, the kind of silence that follows realization, where every detail becomes sharper, every glance heavier. The chandeliers above cast a warm golden glow across polished marble floors that reflected every step she took. And for the first time that night, those reflections did not diminish her presence. They amplified it. Guests who had moments ago been laughing near the entrance now stood frozen in place, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and quiet recalculation, because the woman they had dismissed was now walking beside Adrian Volkov, as if she had always belonged there, as if the space itself had been waiting for her arrival. And Adrian did not rush ahead, did not lead in a way that asserted dominance. Instead, he walked in pace with her, a subtle alignment that spoke louder than any declaration. His presence no longer just commanding the room, but redirecting it, reshaping it around a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. A server passing by slowed instinctively, eyes flickering toward Lena with a different kind of attention now. Not curiosity, not judgment, but awareness, because recognition has a way of spreading quietly, without instruction. The supervisor remained just inside the doorway, watching, his earlier certainty replaced by something closer to understanding, because now the pattern was complete, the invitation, the timing, the placement at the entrance. It had never been accidental, it had been intentional. Every moment outside had been part of something larger, something designed, and as that realization settled, his posture shifted again, not in authority, but in humility. The guard lingered behind, his hands now still at his sides, the radio no longer pressed to his ear, because there was nothing left to enforce, nothing left to correct. Only something to witness. The room itself seemed to respond in layers. Conversations paused, resumed in lower tones. Eyes followed without being obvious, because no one wanted to be seen staring, and yet no one could fully look away. Lena's steps remained steady, measured, not rushed, not hesitant, her gaze forward, her expression composed. But there was a quiet strength in the way she moved now. Not because anything about her had changed, but because everything around her had, and that difference, subtle but undeniable, carried through the entire space. They passed a long table lined with crystal glasses and carefully arranged place settings. Each detail curated for perfection, and yet none of it held the same weight as the moment unfolding between them. Adrian slowed slightly as they reached the center of the room, the point where the light was strongest, where the space opened fully, and for a brief second, he stopped, not abruptly, not to draw attention, but simply to let the moment settle. And when he turned his gaze outward, it was not toward a single person, but toward the room as a whole, acknowledging its presence without seeking its approval. "Take a good look," he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying just far enough to be heard by those closest, and then further, as silence allowed it to travel. "Because tonight is not about who walks in," he continued, pausing just long enough for the words to land. "It is about how you treat them before they do." And the sentence, simple and measured, moved through the room like a quiet wave, touching each person differently, because it did not accuse, it revealed. And revelation has a way of making people confront themselves without needing to be told. No one responded immediately, no one challenged, because there was nothing to argue with, only something to recognize. A woman near the back lowered her gaze, her earlier amusement replaced by something quieter, more reflective. A man who had laughed near the entrance shifted his stance, his confidence tempered by the realization that he had been seen, not individually, but completely. And the weight of that understanding settled deeper than any direct confrontation could have. Adrian's gaze softened slightly as he turned back to Lena. Not with pity, not with obligation, but with respect, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. "You did exactly what you were meant to do," he said quietly, his voice no longer carrying across the room, but existing only between them. And Lena met his eyes, her expression steady, her presence unchanged, because she had never come here to prove anything about herself. She had come to reveal something about them, and now that it had been done, there was nothing left to force, nothing left to defend. The room remained still for another moment, held in that quiet space between what had been and what had just been revealed. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, movement returned, conversations resumed, but softer now, more measured, as if something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, something that would not be undone by time or distraction. And as Lena stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer unseen, it was not her presence that defined the moment. It was the reflection she had created in everyone around her, and the realization that respect, once withheld, could never be given back in the same way again. The room did not return to what it had been, not completely, because something once seen cannot be unseen, and something once understood cannot be ignored, even when people try to move past it. The music resumed its rhythm. Soft conversations rebuilt themselves in fragments. Glasses clinked again. But beneath it all there was a difference, a quiet awareness threading through every interaction, every glance, every decision. And Lena stood in the center of it, without needing to move, without needing to speak, because her presence had already done what it was meant to do. Adrian stepped slightly back, not to distance himself from her, but to allow the room to breathe around what had just happened, his role no longer to direct, but to let the moment settle into memory. And memory, in a place like this, was far more powerful than any announcement. A woman who had laughed earlier approached slowly, her steps measured, her confidence softened. "I did not realize," she began, her voice careful, searching for something that would bridge the gap between who she had been moments ago and who she wanted to appear to be now. But Lena did not respond immediately. She simply looked at her, not with judgment, not with acceptance, but with clarity, the kind that does not need to correct because it has already revealed enough. The woman hesitated, her words faltering, and then she nodded slightly, stepping back, understanding, without being told, that some things cannot be undone through explanation. Across the room, the man who had made the quiet joke near the entrance avoided looking in Lena's direction altogether. his earlier ease replaced by something heavier, something that sat with him whether he acknowledged it or not. And that was the nature of what had just happened. It did not demand apologies. It did not require confrontation. It simply existed. And in existing, it changed everything. The supervisor remained near the doorway. His posture no longer defined by control, but by reflection, because he had seen the shift from the beginning, had felt the moment when assumption gave way to understanding. And now he carried that knowledge with a weight that would follow him beyond this night. The guard stood further back, quieter than before. His gaze lowered, not out of shame alone, but out of recognition, because for the first time, he understood that his role had not just been to protect a space, but to define it. And that realization settled deeper than any correction ever could. Lena finally moved again, not toward the center, not toward the spotlight, but toward the edge of the room, where a large window overlooked the city, the lights stretching for miles, each one a reminder of how many stories unfolded beyond a single moment. She paused there, her reflection faint against the glass, and for a second, she allowed herself to exhale, not from relief, not from exhaustion, but from completion. Because what had needed to happen had happened. Adrian joined her after a moment, his presence quieter now, less commanding, more human. "They will remember this," he said, his voice low, not as a statement of power, but of understanding. Lena nodded slightly, her gaze still on the city beyond. "They should," she replied, and there was no pride in her tone, no triumph, only truth, because this had never been about proving herself. It had been about revealing something they had chosen not to see. Adrian studied her for a brief moment, then gave a small nod, not as acknowledgement of her role, but of her impact, the kind that does not fade when the night ends. The room behind them continued to move, to shift, but it no longer felt the same, because now every interaction carried the echo of what had been exposed. Every smile measured against a new awareness, every assumption questioned. And that was the quiet justice of it, not loud, not forceful, but lasting. Lena turned slightly from the window, her posture as steady as it had been from the moment she arrived, and as she moved back into the room, no one stopped her, no one questioned her, because the space had already been redefined, not by permission, but by truth. And Adrian watched her go, his expression unreadable to anyone else. But in his eyes there was something rare, something that had not been there before, not power, not control, but respect, the kind that is not given lightly and cannot be taken away. And as the night continued, as conversations resumed and the surface returned to its polished calm, there was one thing that remained unchanged beneath it all, something every person there would carry with them long after the lights dimmed and the doors closed. A single understanding that could not be undone, that dignity does not ask to be recognized. It reveals itself, and when it does, the world around it has no choice but to see.